What would you do if five hungry children appeared in your life and asked for something as simple as your leftover food? Most people would give them the food and move on with their day. But sometimes a single moment of kindness can unlock a story so powerful, so transformative, that it changes not just one life, but nine lives forever. Today, I want to share with you the remarkable true story of Mason Reed and five little girls who proved that families aren't always born, sometimes they're chosen. This is a story about a man who thought his chance at fatherhood was over. Children who had learned to survive on their own, and a love so unexpected that it rebuilt an entire community's understanding of what family can look like. You're about to hear about courage that comes in five-year-old packages, about mothers who make impossible choices, about teachers who become guardians, and about how the most broken hearts can create the strongest foundations for love. This isn't just a story about adoption or foster care. This is a story about what happens when ordinary people choose to see extraordinary possibilities in unexpected moments. It's about second chances, about chosen families, and about how sometimes the most beautiful endings begin with the most devastating losses. Over the next hour and a half, you'll witness a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about family parenting and the power of showing up for people who need you most. If stories of transformation move you, if you believe in the power of kindness to change lives, and if you've ever wondered whether love really can conquer the impossible, then settle in. This is the story that started with five simple words on a snowy December day in Montana and ended with a family that proves love doesn't follow rules, it writes its own. Are you ready? Let's begin. Mason Reed had given up on miracles 3 years ago. On this gray December afternoon in Cedar Falls, Montana, he sat alone at a corner table outside Murphy's Diner, methodically cutting through a piece of fried chicken that had long since grown cold. The snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, blanketing the small town of 500 souls in a silence so complete it felt like the world had forgotten how to breathe. At 52, Mason had become a man of routines. Wake at dawn, tend to the animals on his 40-acre farm, drive into town for lunch at Murphy's. Always the same table, always the same meal, always alone. The townspeople had grown accustomed to his presence the way they might notice an old oak tree, familiar, unchanging part of the landscape, but somehow separate from the life flowing around it. He hadn't always been this way. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago, Mason Reed had been a different man entirely. A man who laughed at his 6-year-old daughter Amy's knock-knock jokes over breakfast. A man who slow danced with his wife Rachel in their farmhouse kitchen while dinner simmered on the stove. A man who believed that tomorrow would always be better than today because tomorrow meant more time with the two people who made his world complete. The accident had stolen more than his family. It had stolen his faith in possibility. Now as he sat beneath the diner's weathered awning, watching snowflakes melt on his coffee cup, Mason existed in a kind of suspended animation. He ran his farm with mechanical precision, spoke when spoken to, fulfilled his obligations to the community bank, where he'd worked for 15 years before Rachel's life insurance allowed him to step back. But he wasn't really living. He was simply occupying space, marking time, until time finally decided to be merciful and let him rejoin the two people who mattered most. The diner behind him buzzed with the low murmur of conversations between neighbors who'd known each other since childhood. Margaret O'Sullivan, the owner, bustled between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been serving coffee and comfort to the same faces for 30 years. Through the frosted windows, Mason could see old Pete Kowalski holding court at the corner booth, probably regaling anyone who'd listen with stories from his days working the railroad. Mrs. Henderson from the post office sat with her sister, their heads bent over what looked like vacation photos spread across the checkered tablecloth. Normal life. The kind Mason used to be part of back when participating in the world felt natural instead of like an elaborate performance he couldn't quite remember how to give. He was halfway through his mashed potatoes, lost in the rhythm of fork against plate, when the whisper came. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was small, uncertain, barely audible above the soft patter of snow against the awning. Mason's hand stilled the fork suspended midway to his mouth. For a moment he wondered if he'd imagined it. The grief had played tricks on him before, phantom voices calling his name. The sound of Amy's laughter carried on the wind. Rachel's humming, drifting from their empty bedroom. But then it came again, slightly stronger this time, though still threaded with the kind of timidity that comes from being disappointed too many times. "May we have your leftovers, sir?" Mason turned slowly and the world seemed to shift on its axis. 5 little girls stood clustered together just beyond the edge of the diner's overhang, where the snow fell unimpeded onto their small shoulders. They ranged in age from what looked like fuck to maybe 8 or 9, pressed close together for warmth like a huddle of sparrows seeking shelter from a storm. Their clothes told a story Mason recognized from his banking days, a story of families stretched too thin of choices between heating bills and new coats of pride swallowing itself in the face of necessity. The oldest girl, with dark hair escaping from beneath a knitted cap that had seen better winters, stood slightly in front of the others. Her chin was raised in a gesture of defiance that didn't quite mask the vulnerability in her brown eyes. Behind her, a redhead with freckles dusting her cheeks wore a coat 2 sizes too big, its sleeves swallowing her hands. Twin girls with matching blonde braids shared what appeared to be a single pair of mittens between them, taking turns warming their fingers. And at the very back, partially hidden behind the others, stood the smallest, a little girl with curls that caught snowflakes, like tiny diamonds, wearing a dress that might have been pretty once before too many washings had faded its color to the gray of old dishwater. But it wasn't their clothes that stopped Mason's breath. It wasn't the way they shivered, despite trying to hold themselves still, or how they'd positioned themselves so strategically that only someone sitting at his exact angle could see them. It was their eyes. 5 pairs of eyes, each a different color of brown-green, blue, hazel gray, but all carrying the same expression. It was a look Mason recognized with a jolt of recognition that felt like a physical blow. He'd seen it in his own reflection for the past 3 years. It was the look of people who had learned not to expect much from the world, who had trained themselves to hope quietly, carefully, ready to accept disappointment as the natural order of things. It was the look of the left behind. "How long have you girls been standing out there?" Mason asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The words seemed to scrape against his throat, unused as he was to conversations that mattered. The oldest girl, Hope he would learn later, squared her shoulders in a gesture that reminded him achingly of Amy when she was trying to be brave about getting a shot at the doctor's office. "Not long," she said, which Mason immediately understood to mean far longer than any child should stand in the snow waiting for the courage to ask a stranger for food. He looked past them toward the street, expecting to see a parent, a guardian, someone responsible for these 5 small souls. But Main Street was empty except for the steady fall of snow and the warm glow spilling from shop windows. Even the sidewalks bore only their small footprints leading from the direction of the post office and stopping here at Murphy's Diner, where a lonely man sat with more food than he could finish and a heart that had forgotten how to say no to anyone who looked as lost as he felt. "Where are your parents?" The question came out more gently this time, though Mason wasn't sure when he'd made the decision to soften his voice. The girls exchanged glances, quick, wordless communication that spoke of shared secrets and survival strategies learned too young. It was Hope who answered, her voice steady, despite the way her breath misted in the cold air. "Our mama had to go away for a while," she said. "She'll be back." There was something in the way she said it, a rehearsed quality, that suggested this explanation had been given before to other adults who'd asked uncomfortable questions. Mason had heard enough half-truths in his 15 years of banking to recognize one when it was standing in front of him, wrapped in 2 thin coats and held together by the fierce protection of a little girl trying to hold her world together. "How long is a while?" he asked quietly. Hope's composure wavered for just a moment, long enough for Mason to catch a glimpse of the scared little girl beneath the protective armor she'd wrapped around herself. "4 days," she whispered. 4 days. Mason felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking exactly, but shifting like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. 4 days these children had been on their own, somehow finding food and shelter, somehow surviving in a world that seemed designed to overlook people exactly like them. Behind Hope, the smallest girl, the one with the curls and the faded dress, tugged on the coat of one of the twins. "I'm hungry, Zoe," she whispered, the words carrying clearly in the crisp air. And in that moment, something inside Mason Reed, something that had been dormant for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, stirred to life. He looked down at his plate, still half full of food he'd been pushing around more than eating. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, a dinner roll he hadn't touched. Enough to fill 5 small stomachs, at least for tonight. Enough to push back the cold and the hunger for a few hours to give these children one moment of warmth in what had clearly been a very cold world. Without a word, Mason pushed back his chair and stood up. Mason pushed his plate toward the edge of the table and gestured to the empty chairs around him. "Sit down," he said simply. "All of you." The five girls hesitated, exchanging those quick glances again, a silent conversation that spoke of hard-learned caution. It was the smallest one who moved first, drawn perhaps by the sight of the warm dinner roll, or simply by the kind of trust that exists in children before the world teaches them better. She took a tentative step forward, then another, until she stood beside Mason's table with her small hands pressed against the metal edge. "It's okay, Emma," Hope said softly, making the decision for all of them. "He seems kind." Emma. The name hit Mason with unexpected force. His Amy had been 6 when she died, the same age as this little girl with the snow-dusted curls. For a moment, the similarity made it hard to breathe, but then Emma looked up at him with eyes the color of summer sky and smiled a real smile uncomplicated by the wariness her older sisters carried, and Mason felt something in his chest unclench. One by one, the girls climbed onto the chairs around his table. They moved carefully as if afraid that too much enthusiasm might cause this offer of kindness to evaporate like morning mist. Hope helped Emma into the chair beside Mason while the others arranged themselves around the table with the practiced efficiency of children who'd learned to make themselves small to take up as little space as possible. "I'm Mason," he said, cutting the chicken into smaller pieces. "Mason Reed." "I'm Hope," the oldest girl said, her voice still carrying that careful formality. "This is Zoe and Aria," she indicated the redhead and one of the blonde twins, "and Ruby and Emma." The other twin and the smallest girl nodded in turn, their eyes fixed on the food Mason was dividing among 5 paper napkins Margaret had wordlessly provided when she'd spotted the gathering. Margaret O'Sullivan had been serving food at Murphy's Diner for 30 years, and in that time she'd developed an intuition about when to ask questions and when to simply provide extra napkins and pretend not to notice anything unusual. She set down a stack of plastic cups and disappeared back inside without a word, though Mason caught her watching through the window with the kind of expression that suggested this conversation would be discussed at tomorrow's coffee klatch. The girls ate with the careful deliberation of people who understood the value of food. No grabbing, no rushing. Each bite was considered savored, made to last. Mason found himself remembering meals with Amy, how she'd devoured her favorites, and pushed aside anything green, chattering constantly between bites about her day at school or the book they were reading together. These children ate in silence, their attention focused entirely on the simple miracle of a warm meal. "The chicken's good," Emma said after a few minutes, her voice shy but pleased. "Murphy's makes the best fried chicken in 3 counties," Mason replied, surprised by how natural the conversation felt. "Have you girls been in Cedar Falls long?" Another one of those quick exchanges passed between the sisters. It was Zoe who answered this time, the redhead with freckles that stood out like copper pennies against her pale skin. "We've been staying in the shed behind the post office," she said matter-of-factly. "It's not too cold if you pile up the mail bags." Mason's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "The storage shed for 4 days. It's better than some places we've stayed," Hope said quickly defensively. "And Mama said she'd be back. She just had to take care of something important." There was that rehearsed quality again, the words of a child who'd been tasked with explaining adult decisions she didn't fully understand. Mason had heard similar explanations from Amy when she tried to justify why her goldfish couldn't come back from the farm they'd supposedly sent him to, or why Grandpa couldn't visit anymore after he'd gone to be with the angels. "What kind of important thing?" Mason asked gently. Hope's composure cracked slightly. She looked down at her hands, which were wrapped around the warm dinner roll like it was a small treasure. She didn't say. She got scared about something and said we had to hide for a while, that she'd come back when it was safe. The pieces of a familiar story began to fall into place in Mason's mind. Domestic violence, probably. A woman fleeing with her children, leaving them somewhere she thought was safe, while she tried to resolve whatever danger had sent them running. He'd seen it before during his banking days, women who came in asking about opening accounts under maiden names, or wanting to know about safe deposit boxes their husbands couldn't access. "Has anyone else been helping you?" he asked. "Any other adults?" "The lady at the bakery gave us day-old bread yesterday," Aria said, speaking for the first time. She had the same blonde hair as Ruby, but where her twin was quietly observant, Aria seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. And Mr. Peterson at the gas station let us use the bathroom, but he said we couldn't hang around because it might bring trouble. Mason felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, not at these children, but at a world that could look at 5 hungry little girls and see trouble instead of human beings in need of help. It was the same anger he'd felt during his banking career, when families lost their homes to medical debt, or when elderly customers got scammed out of their retirement savings. The anger of someone who'd seen too much of how the world treated its most vulnerable members. Well, he said, making a decision that felt as natural as breathing, "You won't be staying in any storage shed tonight." 5 pairs of eyes looked up at him with expressions ranging from hope to disbelief. "What do you mean?" Hope asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason thought about his farmhouse empty and echoing with 3 years of silence. He thought about the guest bedrooms that hadn't seen visitors since the funeral, about the kitchen that had been designed for a family and had been serving an audience of one for far too long. He thought about Amy's room, which he'd left exactly as it was the day she died, and how maybe it was time for children's laughter to fill those spaces again. "I mean, you're coming home with me," he said, "just for tonight until we figure out what comes next." The silence that followed was profound. Even the snow seemed to pause in its falling, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for their answer. It was Emma who broke the spell. She scrambled down from her chair and threw her small arms around Mason's waist, hugging him with the fierce intensity that only children possess. "Are you an angel?" she asked, her voice muffled against his coat. "Mama said angels help people when they need it most." Mason's throat closed up completely. He looked down at this little girl so much like Amy in her absolute faith in the goodness of strangers, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Purpose, the sense that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "No, sweetheart," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm just a man who has more room in his house than he knows what to do with." Hope stood up slowly, her brown eyes searching his face with the intensity of someone much older than her 8 or 9 years. "You don't know us," she said. "You don't know anything about us or where we came from or what kind of trouble might be following us." "You're right," Mason said. "I don't know any of those things. But I know you're 5 little girls who've been taking care of yourselves for 4 days, and that's 4 days too many. I know you're cold and hungry and scared, even though you're trying not to show it. And I know that my house has been too quiet for too long." He stood up, leaving money on the table for the meal, and a generous tip for Margaret, who was still pretending not to watch from inside the diner. "My truck's right across the street," he said. "It's warm and the drive to my place is only about 10 minutes. You can decide when we get there if you want to stay the night or if you'd rather I bring you back to town. But either way, you're not sleeping in a storage shed. Not while I can do something about it." The girls gathered their few possessions: a small backpack Hope had been carrying, a stuffed animal that Ruby clutched against her chest, mittens that belonged to no one in particular but got passed around as needed. They moved with the efficient teamwork of a family unit that had learned to depend entirely on each other. As they walked toward Mason's pickup truck, an old red Ford that had seen better decades but still ran reliably, Emma slipped her small hand into his. Her fingers were cold despite the mittens someone had given her, and so small they almost disappeared in his larger palm. "Mr. Mason," she said as he helped her into the truck's cab, where all 5 girls squeezed together on the bench seat like a row of sparrows on a telephone wire. "Yes, sweetheart. Will you tell us a story when we get to your house? Mama used to tell us stories, but I can't remember the endings anymore." Mason looked at these 5 little girls who had somehow wandered into his carefully ordered, quietly desperate life and turned it upside down in the space of a single meal. Hope sat protectively close to Emma, while the twins flanked them on either side, and Zoe pressed against the passenger door with the alert stillness of someone ready to run if necessary. They were a unit, a family forged by circumstance and held together by the fierce love that children can have for each other when the adult world fails them. "I think I can manage a story or two," Mason said, starting the engine and pulling away from Murphy's Diner. In the rearview mirror, he could see Margaret standing in the doorway, cell phone in hand, probably already calling her sister to share the news that Mason Reed, the hermit of Cedar Falls, had just driven off with 5 mysterious children. Let them talk, he thought. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't care what the town thought about his choices. The drive to the farmhouse passed in relative quiet, broken only by Emma's soft humming and the whispered conversations between the other girls. Mason found himself glancing in the rearview mirror more than necessary, still not quite believing this was real. An hour ago, he'd been a man eating lunch alone, counting down the hours until he could return to his empty house and the routines that kept his grief at bay. Now he was driving through a snowstorm with 5 children who needed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. When they turned up the long gravel driveway that led to his farmhouse, Mason saw his home through their eyes, a 2-story white building with a wraparound porch and dormant flower beds that Rachel had tended with such care. Smoke rose from the chimney where he'd built a fire before leaving for town, and warm light spilled from the kitchen windows. It looked, he realized, like exactly what it was, a family home that had been waiting for a family to fill it again. "It's beautiful," Hope said softly, the first words she'd spoken since they'd left the diner. "It's big," Emma added with wonder. "Do you live here all by yourself?" "I do," Mason said, parking the truck near the front porch. "Have for the past 3 years. It gets pretty quiet." "We're not very quiet," Zoe warned with the honesty of a child who'd been told to modify her behavior too many times. "Emma talks in her sleep and Ruby snores and Arya asks a lot of questions." "Good, good," Mason said and meant it. This old house could use some mods. He helped them down from the truck, watching as they stood in a small cluster on his front porch, snow still falling around them like something from a Christmas card. In the porch light, he could see details he'd missed at the diner, the careful way Hope had braided Emma's hair that morning, the fact that Arya's coat was held together with safety pins, the alertness in Ruby's eyes that suggested she was cataloging every detail of their surroundings. These were children who'd learned to be observant, to notice escape routes and potential threats. Children who'd been disappointed by adults before and weren't ready to trust completely, no matter how kind the stranger or how warm the house. Mason unlocked the front door and gestured for them to enter first. They stepped inside with the cautious wonder of visitors in a museum, taking in the hardwood floors and braided rugs, the family photos on the mantelpiece, the comfortable furniture that had been chosen for living rather than impressing. "Are those your family?" Hope asked, nodding toward the photographs. Mason's chest tightened. "Yes, my wife Rachel and my daughter Amy. They died 3 years ago." He waited for the questions that usually followed this revelation, how, when, why, but the girls simply nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance of children who understood that sometimes the people you love go away and don't come back. "That's why you were eating alone," Emma said with the startling insight that children sometimes possess. "You miss them." "Every day," Mason admitted. Emma walked over to the mantelpiece and studied the largest photograph, Mason, Rachel, and 6-year-old Amy at the county fair, all 3 of them laughing at something outside the frame. "She looks nice," Emma said. "Your little girl. She looks like she gave good hugs." "The best hugs in the world," Mason said, his voice thick with emotion. Emma turned back to him with that serious expression children get when they're about to say something important. "I give good hugs too. If you want, I could hug you sometimes, so you don't miss her so much." And with those words, something that had been frozen solid in Mason Reed's chest for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, finally completely thawed. The first night passed in a blur of small discoveries and careful adjustments. Mason found himself moving through his house with renewed awareness, seeing it through the eyes of 5 children who had been living in a storage shed for 4 days. The guest bedrooms he'd avoided for 3 years suddenly had purpose again. Clean sheets appeared from linen closets. Extra blankets emerged from storage, and the upstairs hallway filled with whispered conversations and muffled giggles as the girls settled into spaces that felt impossibly luxurious after their recent accommodations. Emma had fallen asleep on the living room sofa while Mason told them the story she'd requested, a rambling tale about a family of rabbits who lived in a magical garden behind his barn. When he'd finished, Hope had carefully carried her smallest sister upstairs, and Mason had been struck by the tenderness in her movements, the way she tucked the blanket around Emma's chin and smoothed her curls back from her forehead. At 80 years old, Hope had already learned to be a mother in ways that made Mason's heart ache. By morning, the farmhouse felt different, not just fuller, but alive in a way it hadn't been since the accident. Mason woke to the sound of voices drifting up from the kitchen. Real voices, not the phantom conversations his grief-stricken mind sometimes conjured. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs to find all 5 girls gathered around his kitchen table, sharing what appeared to be the last of a box of cereal they had found in his pantry. "Good morning," he said, and 5 faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from shy smiles to cautious optimism. "We didn't want to wake you up," Hope said quickly, "but Emma was really hungry, and we found the cereal and—" "It's fine," Mason interrupted gently. "More than fine. This is your kitchen too for as long as you're here. You don't need permission to eat when you're hungry." He moved to the stove muscle memory, taking over as he began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator and pantry. Eggs, flour milk, vanilla, the components of the pancakes Rachel used to make on weekend mornings when Amy would climb onto the counter to help measure ingredients and inevitably spill flour all over the kitchen. "Who wants pancakes?" he asked. The response was immediate and unanimous. Even Hope's careful reserve cracked slightly as she nodded with the enthusiasm of a child who hadn't had a hot breakfast in days. Mason found himself falling into a rhythm he'd almost forgotten, the comfortable choreography of cooking for people he cared about. The girls watched with fascination as he whisked batter and heated the griddle, asking questions about every step of the process. Aria wanted to know why you had to let the batter rest. Zoe wondered if you could put chocolate chips in pancakes, and Ruby asked if she could help flip them when they were ready. "Of course you can help," Mason said, handing Ruby the spatula. "Cooking's more fun with company." As the first batch of pancakes emerged golden and steaming from the griddle, Mason realized he was humming a habit he'd lost completely after the accident, but that seemed to return naturally in the presence of children's laughter. Emma had somehow managed to get syrup in her hair, despite the bib he'd fashioned from a kitchen towel, while the twins argued good-naturedly about whether pancakes were better with butter or jam. Hope sat at the head of the table like a small mother, making sure everyone had enough to eat before taking a bite herself. After breakfast, Mason announced his intention to drive them into town to visit the school. The girls exchanged those quick glances again, their silent communication system that spoke of shared apprehensions. "Are you going to make us go to school?" Zoe asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Eventually, yes," Mason said. "But today, we're just going to meet the principal and see what we need to do to get you enrolled. Education's important, and you've already missed enough school." "We've been to a lot of schools," Arya said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes we liked them, sometimes we didn't. Sometimes we didn't stay long enough to find out." The comment offered another glimpse into the unstable life these children had lived before arriving in Cedar Falls. Mason found himself wondering how many times they'd been uprooted, how many new classrooms they'd walked into as strangers, how many friends they'd left behind when circumstances forced another move. "Well, Cedar Falls Elementary is a good school," he said. "Small classes, nice teachers. I think you'll like it here." The drive into town revealed more about his unexpected house guests. Emma chattered constantly from her position, squeezed between her sisters, pointing out every dog bird and interesting cloud formation they passed. The twins maintained a running commentary about the differences between Cedar Falls and other places they'd lived. Apparently that they'd spent time in at least 3 different states over the past 2 years. Hope remained quietly observant, but Mason caught her looking at him in the rearview mirror with an expression he couldn't quite read. Cedar Falls Elementary occupied a brick building that had been serving the community's children for nearly 60 years. It was the kind of school where everyone knew everyone, where teachers remembered siblings and sometimes even parents from their own elementary days. Mason had attended classes in these same hallways 35 years ago, and Amy had been in first grade here when she died. The principal's office held memories that made Mason's chest tight, but he pushed through them as he led the 5 girls down the familiar corridor. The walls were lined with student artwork and achievement certificates, the cheerful chaos of an institution dedicated to nurturing young minds. Sarah Mitchell was newer to Cedar Falls than most. She'd arrived 2 years ago to take over as principal when the previous administrator retired. At 32, she brought fresh energy to the school while respecting its small-town traditions. Mason had met her briefly at community events, but they'd never had occasion for extended conversation. "Mr. Reed," she said, rising from behind her desk as they entered her office. "What a pleasant surprise. And who do we have here?" Mason made introductions, watching as Sarah knelt to the girl's eye level for individual greetings. There was something in her manner, a natural ease with children that went beyond professional training, that made even the most reserved of his house guests begin to relax. "We have some interesting circumstances," Mason explained once the girls were seated in the chairs Sarah had arranged in a semicircle. "These young ladies need to enroll in school, but their documentation situation is complicated. Sarah's expression remained professionally neutral, but Mason caught the quick assessment she made of the girls' clothing, their body language, the way Hope positioned herself protectively near her younger sisters. "Why don't we start with what we can do today," Sarah suggested, "and worry about paperwork later. I'd love to show you around the school, introduce you to some teachers, maybe sit in on a class or two to see how things work here." The tour that followed revealed Sarah Mitchell to be the kind of educator every parent hopes their child will encounter. She knew every student they passed, by name stopped, to admire art projects and celebrate small achievements, and somehow managed to make Hope and her sisters feel special, rather than like charity cases who needed accommodation. In the third grade classroom, Emma's eyes lit up at the reading corner, filled with picture books. The twins were fascinated by the science center where students were growing bean plants in clear containers. Zoe asked thoughtful questions about the art supplies, while Hope observed everything with the calculating attention of someone evaluating whether this place was safe enough to trust. "What do you think?" Sarah asked as they concluded the tour in her office. "It's nice," Hope said carefully. "The teachers seem kind." "They are," Sarah confirmed, "and we have a wonderful support system here for students who might need extra help adjusting to a new environment." Mason appreciated the diplomatic way she phrased it, acknowledging the girls' circumstances without making them feel singled out for being different. "There's something else," Sarah added, pulling a cardboard box from behind her desk. "We keep emergency supplies for students who might need them. Winter clothes, school supplies, things like that. Community donations." She opened the box to reveal an assortment of warm coats, hats, mittens, and boots in various sizes. The girls' eyes widened at the sight of clothing that wasn't worn thin or held together with safety pins. "Could we?" Hope began, then stopped herself. "Of course," Sarah said warmly. "That's exactly what these are for. Why don't you each pick out whatever you need?" What followed was a cautious shopping expedition that gradually became more enthusiastic as the girls realized this wasn't charity that came with strings attached, but genuine kindness offered without conditions. Emma found a purple coat that fit perfectly and made her twirl with delight. The twins discovered matching boots that actually matched each other instead of being cobbled together from whatever was available. Zoe selected a hat with ear flaps that she pronounced seriously warm, while Hope chose a navy blue coat that was practical and understated the choice of someone who'd learned not to draw attention to herself. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "I run a small reading group after school. Nothing formal, just hot chocolate and books for anyone who's interested. We meet in the library on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You'd be welcome to join us anytime." The offer was extended to all the girls, but Mason noticed Sarah's attention lingering on Hope, whose reading level had clearly impressed her during their classroom visits. "We'll think about it," Hope said with the cautious politeness of a child who'd learned not to commit to anything too quickly. As they left the school, arms full of winter clothing and spirits considerably lighter than when they'd arrived, Mason found himself walking beside Sarah toward the parking lot. "They're lovely girls," she said quietly out of the earshot of the children who were comparing their new acquisitions beside his truck. "They are," Mason agreed. "They've been through more than children should have to handle." "And you're planning to—" "I don't know yet," Mason admitted. "For now, I'm just making sure they're safe and fed. The rest, we'll figure out as we go." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes that's the best approach. Children are remarkably resilient when they feel secure. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "If you need anything help with enrollment paperwork, tutoring, someone to talk through options, please don't hesitate to call." There was something in her tone that suggested the offer extended beyond professional courtesy, and Mason found himself looking at her more closely. Sarah Mitchell had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her manner with the girls had been natural and unforced, and she'd handled their unusual situation with a combination of professionalism and genuine care that impressed him. "Thank you," he said. "I have a feeling we'll need all the help we can get." The drive home was markedly different from the morning trip. The girls chattered excitedly about the school, the teachers they'd met, and the reading group Sarah had mentioned. Even Hope seemed more animated, describing the library's collection and wondering aloud about whether they'd be staying long enough to participate in the winter reading challenge. "How long do you think we'll be here?" Arya asked as they turned into the farmhouse driveway. It was the question Mason had been dreading because he didn't have a good answer. The responsible thing would be to contact social services to report 5 unaccompanied minors and let the system take over. But the thought of these children disappearing into foster care, likely separated from each other, made something fierce and protective rise in his chest. I don't know, he said honestly, but you're safe here for as long as you need to be. That afternoon, while the girls explored the farmhouse and its surroundings with the enthusiasm of children discovering that they were allowed to touch things without permission, Mason found himself making phone calls he'd never expected to make. First to his lawyer, Tom Harrison, explaining the situation in general terms and asking about his legal options. Then to Dr. Patricia Webb, the family physician who'd cared for Amy and might be willing to see 5 children who desperately needed medical checkups but might not have insurance or documentation. Both conversations were encouraging in their own ways. Tom promised to research guardianship laws and emergency custody procedures, while Dr. Webb agreed to see the girls the following week, payment and paperwork details to be worked out later. By evening, the farmhouse had been thoroughly investigated by 5 curious children who treated each room like a new country to explore. They discovered the piano in the living room, Rachel's piano silent since her death, and Emma had insisted on playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with one finger while the others sang along. They'd found the craft supplies in what used to be Rachel's sewing room and spent an hour making construction paper snowflakes to decorate the kitchen windows. They'd even ventured into Amy's room, which Mason had left exactly as it was, and emerged with quiet reverence to ask if they could help him organize her toys to donate to other children who might need them. She would have liked that, Mason said, his voice thick with emotion at their thoughtfulness. Amy always loved sharing. As bedtime approached, the girls had established routines that spoke of long practice at adapting to new environments. Hope helped Emma with her bath while the twins organized their few possessions, and Zoe tested every light switch and door lock, a security check that made Mason's heart ache with understanding. Mr. Mason, Emma called from the top of the stairs as he was banking the fire in the living room fireplace. Yes, sweetheart. Could you come say goodnight, and maybe, could you tell us another story? Mason climbed the stairs to find all 5 girls squeezed into one of the guest bedrooms, despite having 3 bedrooms available to them. They'd pushed the twin beds together and arranged themselves like a litter of puppies seeking comfort in proximity after too many nights of uncertainty. Another rabbit story, he asked, settling into the chair beside the makeshift dormitory. Yes, please, Emma said, while the others nodded agreement. So Mason found himself spinning another tale about the magical garden behind his barn, where rabbit families lived in cozy burrows and looked out for each other through long winters and short summers. As he spoke, he watched the girls gradually relax their breathing, deepening their small faces, losing the watchful tension that seemed to be their default expression. Hope was the last to fall asleep, and when Mason thought she was unconscious, she whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Mason, for everything." "Thank you," he whispered back, meaning it more than she could possibly understand. Downstairs, Mason sat in his armchair and looked around the living room that had been a mausoleum for 3 years and was now scattered with construction paper snowflakes and picture books. The silence he'd cultivated so carefully had been replaced by the soft sounds of sleeping children, rustling blankets, quiet breathing, the occasional murmur of dreams. For the first time since the accident, Mason Reed felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The transformation happened gradually, like spring arriving in Montana, barely noticeable at first, then suddenly everywhere at once. By the end of their first week at the farmhouse, the 5 girls had settled into routines that felt both natural and miraculous to Mason. Hope had taken charge of morning preparations, making sure everyone was dressed and ready for the school day. The twins had discovered Mason's small workshop in the barn and spent afternoons learning to identify different tools and hardware. Zoe had appointed herself chief assistant in the kitchen, standing on a step stool to help with dinner preparations. And Emma had claimed the rocking chair by the living room window as her personal reading nook, where she practiced the words Sarah Mitchell had been teaching her during their after-school sessions. It was Emma who first called him Papa Mason, not in any formal declaration, but casually, naturally, as if the title had always belonged to him. The word had slipped out during breakfast on Tuesday morning as she asked for help cutting her pancakes, and the sudden silence that followed made everyone freeze. Hope's eyes went wide with something approaching panic, while the other girls looked between Emma and Mason with expressions of uncertainty. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, her lower lip trembling. "I didn't mean to. I know you're not our real papa." Mason's throat closed completely. He knelt beside Emma's chair and gently took her small hands in his much larger ones. "Sweetheart," he said carefully, "I would be honored if you wanted to call me Papa Mason. All of you." He looked around the table at 5 faces that had become precious to him in ways he was still learning to understand. "You don't have to if it doesn't feel right, but if it does, then that's what I am." The relief that flooded Emma's face was immediate and radiant. "Really, you want to be our papa?" "More than anything," Mason said, and realized as he spoke the words that they were completely true. Hope's reaction was more complex. At 8 years old, she carried memories of other father figures who had disappointed them, men who had made promises they didn't keep and brought complications into their mother's life. But she also carried the exhausting burden of trying to be an adult before her time, and Mason could see the part of her that desperately wanted to hand that responsibility to someone trustworthy. "What if our real mama comes back?" she asked quietly. "Then we'll figure it out together," Mason said. "Being Papa Mason doesn't mean replacing anyone. It just means I'm here for you for as long as you need me to be." That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship, but it also marked the beginning of new challenges. Word had spread through Cedar Falls about Mason Reed's unusual house guests, and not everyone in the community was as understanding as Sarah Mitchell or Dr. Webb, who had pronounced all 5 girls healthy but undernourished during their medical appointments. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter left in Mason's mailbox on a Thursday morning. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in block letters across plain white paper. Inside, the message was brief and pointed. "You don't know these children or where they came from. Taking in strangers is dangerous. Think about what you're risking." Mason read the anonymous warning twice before folding it carefully and tucking it into his jacket pocket. He said nothing to the girls about it, but found himself checking the locks on the farmhouse doors that night and paying closer attention to unfamiliar cars on the road. The second letter arrived 3 days later, this one more explicit in its implications. "Single men who collect children raise questions. People are talking. Someone should investigate your motives." This time, Mason didn't keep the warning to himself. That evening, after the girls were asleep, he called Tom Harrison. "Someone's trying to cause trouble," he explained, reading both letters over the phone. Tom's response was immediate and reassuring. Anonymous letters are usually the work of cowards who don't have the courage to say their piece face to face. "But Mason, we should talk about making your situation with the girls more official. If someone does decide to make trouble, having legal standing would protect both you and them." "What would that involve?" "Emergency custody to start with. Given that the children have been abandoned." "They weren't abandoned," Mason interrupted. "Their mother left them somewhere she thought was safe while she dealt with whatever danger they were running from." "That's a distinction that might not matter legally," Tom said gently. 4 weeks have passed without contact. In Montana, that constitutes abandonment under the law regardless of the mother's intentions." The words hit Mason like a physical blow. 4 weeks. Had it really been that long? The days had blurred together in a routine of school runs and bedtime stories, homework help, and weekend pancakes. Somewhere in the midst of becoming a father again, he'd lost track of the calendar. "So what you're saying is that even if their mother shows up tomorrow, I might have legal rights." "It's complicated," Tom admitted. "But yes, after 4 weeks of providing care without any contact from the legal guardian, you'd have grounds for an emergency custody petition. The question is whether that's what you want." Mason looked around his living room, where 5 small stockings now hung from the mantelpiece stockings Sarah Mitchell had helped the girls make during art class as Christmas approached. Picture books were stacked on every surface. The piano bench held sheet music for simple songs Emma was learning to play. Every room in the house bore evidence of the family he'd somehow acquired. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "That's what I want." 3 days later, Mason found himself facing a situation that would test everything he thought he understood about his new role as a father. The morning had started like any other pancakes for breakfast, the usual chaos of getting 5 children ready for school, and the comfortable routine of dropping them off at Cedar Falls Elementary before heading to his appointment with Tom Harrison to discuss the custody paperwork. But when he returned home to prepare lunch, Mason discovered something that changed everything. A letter half buried in the snow beside his mailbox, as if it had been dropped there, and covered by the night's snowfall. Unlike the anonymous threats he'd been receiving, this envelope bore a name written in shaky handwriting: "To whoever is taking care of my babies." Mason's hands trembled as he opened it, standing there in the cold beside his mailbox, reading words that would haunt him for days afterward. "If you're reading this, then I guess you found them, my 5 beautiful girls. I know what you must think of me, what kind of mother leaves her children, but I need you to understand that I didn't abandon them. I saved them. Their father, not all of them have the same daddy, but the one who hurt us most, he found us 3 weeks ago. Marcus, I thought I'd gotten far enough away, changed our names enough times, stayed hidden long enough. But he tracked us down to that little apartment in Billings, and when I saw him standing outside Emma's school watching her through the fence, I knew we had to run again. But this time was different. This time he followed us. We spent 2 nights sleeping in my car before it broke down just outside your town. The engine made this terrible noise and then just stopped right there on the highway in the snow. The girls were so cold and Emma was starting to cough, and I knew the shed behind the post office wasn't safe for long, but it was all I could find. I thought I could fix things. I thought I could find work, save money, come back for them with someplace real to go. But Marcus found the car. I saw him checking it 2 days after I left the girls. He knows they're here somewhere in your town. And as long as I'm with them, they'll never be safe, so I'm leaving. Not because I don't love them. God, I love them more than my own life, but because loving them means keeping them away from him. I've been watching from the trees by your house. I see how they smile now. I see how they run and play and act like normal children instead of always looking over their shoulders, always ready to run. You gave them back their childhood. You gave them something I never could: safety, stability, the chance to just be little girls. I don't know who you are, but I know you're good to them. I know they trust you. I can see it in the way Emma holds your hand, the way Hope doesn't have that scared look in her eyes anymore. Please, please take care of them. Let them stay children for as long as they can. Don't let them grow up too fast the way I had to. Don't let them carry the weight of adult fears and adult problems. They deserve to believe in good people and happy endings and all the things I stopped believing in a long time ago. I want to come back to them. Someday when it's safe, when Marcus gives up or gets arrested or just forgets about us. But that might be a very long time, and they can't wait for someday. They need someone now, today, tomorrow, and every day after that. You're their someone now. Please be their someone forever. All my love and all my gratitude, Claire. Mason read the letter 3 times, standing in the snow as the cold seeped through his jacket and the words burned themselves into his memory. By the time he finished, tears were freezing on his cheeks and his hands were shaking with something more than cold. Claire hadn't abandoned her children. She had made the most heartbreaking sacrifice imaginable, giving them up to keep them safe from a threat Mason could barely comprehend. Everything he thought he understood about their situation, about why 5 little girls had been living in a storage shed, and about what kind of mother would leave her children, shifted completely. The letter changed everything and nothing at once. The girls were still his daughters in every way that mattered. His love for them hadn't diminished, his commitment to their welfare hadn't wavered. But now he carried the weight of understanding what their mother had given up and the knowledge that somewhere out there, a woman was sacrificing her own heart to protect theirs. That evening, as the girls gathered around the kitchen table for homework time, Mason found himself studying their faces with new awareness. Hope bent over her math problems with the intense concentration she brought to everything. The twins' heads together as they worked on a science project about the water cycle. Zoe carefully practicing her cursive letters. Emma drawing pictures in the margins of her reading workbook, small flowers and hearts, and stick figures that looked remarkably like their family. They looked content. More than content, they looked secure in a way that Mason now understood was precious and rare in their experience. They weren't looking over their shoulders or listening for footsteps that shouldn't be there. They weren't rationing food or sleeping lightly, ready to run at a moment's notice. They were just children doing homework and arguing about whose turn it was to feed the barn cats and planning what they wanted to ask Santa for Christmas. "Papa Mason," Emma said, looking up from her drawings, "you look sad. Are you thinking about your Rachel and Amy again?" The question, asked with the matter-of-fact concern that children bring to adult emotions, nearly undid him completely. How could he explain that his sadness wasn't about loss this time, but about love, about the overwhelming realization of what had been entrusted to him. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," he said instead, which was also true. "How lucky I am to have 5 beautiful daughters who make every day better than the last." Emma beamed at his answer, but Hope looked up from her math with the sharp attention she paid to anything that seemed important. At 8 years old, she had already learned to read between the lines of adult conversations and to sense the undercurrents that her younger sisters missed. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. "Everything's perfect," Mason said, meaning it completely. "We're perfect just the way we are." Later that night, after the girls were asleep and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Mason sat in his armchair by the fireplace with Claire's letter in his hands. He read it again, trying to imagine the courage it had taken to write those words, to make that choice to walk away from everything that mattered most. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, who had become such an important part of their lives over the past month. Sarah Wara, who understood the girls in ways that went beyond professional training, who seemed to have an intuitive sense of what they needed and when they needed it. There was something in her manner with Hope, and especially a recognition, almost as if she saw something of herself in the oldest girl's fierce protectiveness and premature maturity. The next afternoon, as Sarah helped Emma with her reading while the other girls played in the barn, Mason found himself asking the question that had been building in his mind since their first meeting. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sarah looked up from the picture book she and Emma were sharing. "Of course. You're different with these girls than I've seen teachers be with other children. There's something, I don't know how to describe it, like you understand them in a way that goes beyond professional experience." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her attention apparently focused on helping Emma sound out a difficult word. But Mason could see the slight tension that crept into her shoulders, the way her hand stilled on the page. "You're very observant," she said finally. "Most people don't pick up on that. I've gotten good at reading people over the past month. 5 children will teach you to notice things you might have missed before." Sarah smiled at that, but there was something wistful in the expression. "I suppose they would." She helped Emma turn the page, then looked directly at Mason. "You want to know why I understand what they're going through?" "Only if you want to tell me." Sarah glanced around the kitchen where the comfortable chaos of an active household surrounded them, backpacks by the door, artwork taped to the refrigerator, the lingering smell of the chocolate chip cookies they'd baked that morning. It was a scene of domestic security that seemed to give her courage to speak. "I was 7 when my mother dropped me off at a church in Missoula," she said quietly. "It was a Sunday morning in November, and she told me to wait by the big oak tree in the front yard while she talked to the minister about something important. She said she'd be right back." Mason felt his chest tighten as he began to understand where this story was going. "I waited until it got dark," Sarah continued. "The church ladies found me there around 8 o'clock that night, still holding my Sunday school certificate, like it was some kind of proof that I belonged somewhere. They called the police, but my mother had vanished completely. No forwarding address, no family to contact, nothing." "Sarah," Mason said softly, his voice full of compassion for the 7-year-old girl she had been. 12 foster homes," she continued, her voice steady but distant, as if she were reciting facts about someone else's life. "Some good, some not so good, some just temporary stops because the system didn't know what else to do with me. I aged out at 18 with a backpack, $200, and a college scholarship that saved my life." "Is that why you became a teacher?" "Partly, but mostly it's why I came back to Montana. I spent 10 years teaching in good schools, in good districts, building a career and a life that was safe and predictable. But when the position here opened up, something called me back. Maybe the idea that I could be the adult I needed when I was 7 years old." Mason looked across the kitchen at Emma, who was carefully sounding out words with the patience Sarah was showing her, and felt a deeper appreciation for the woman who had become such an integral part of their family's life. "That's why you understand Hope," he said. "The way she takes care of everyone else, the way she watches for danger that might not even be there." "She's remarkable," Sarah said. "At her age, I was angry at the world for letting me down. Hope has somehow managed to maintain her capacity for trust and love, despite everything she's been through. That takes incredible strength." "She's had good sisters to protect," Mason observed. "Sometimes having people who depend on you gives you strength you didn't know you had. Is that what happened to you?" after Rachel and Amy died? The question caught Mason off guard, though he realized it shouldn't have. Sarah had been observing his transformation over the past month just as closely as he'd been watching hers. I thought my life was over, he admitted. For 3 years, I thought the best part of my life was behind me, that I was just marking time until I could join them. I felt guilty for surviving when they didn't guilty for every moment of happiness or peace I managed to find. And now, Mason looked around his kitchen, alive with evidence of the family that had found him when he needed them most. Now, I think maybe losing them was preparing me for finding these five. Maybe everything that happened, the accident, the grief, the 3 years of learning to live with loss, maybe it was all leading to this moment, this family, this chance to be the father I was meant to be. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the school bus rumbling up the driveway, followed immediately by the thunder of footsteps on the front porch and voices calling out the day's adventures and grievances. "Papa Mason," Zoe called as she burst through the kitchen door. "Guess what happened at school today?" And just like that, the house filled with the beautiful chaos of children home from their day, eager to share their small triumphs and disasters with the adults who loved them. Sarah stayed for dinner, as she had taken to doing several times a week, and Mason watched her interact with his daughters with the natural ease of someone who understood that family wasn't always about blood relations, but about the people who chose to show up for each other day after day. That night, after Sarah had gone home and the girls were asleep, Mason sat down at his kitchen table and wrote a letter of his own. Not to Claire, he had no way of reaching her and wasn't sure what he would say if he could, but to the judge who would be reviewing his custody petition to Tom Harrison, who was helping him navigate the legal complexities, to anyone who might question his right to call these five children his daughters. He wrote about the morning Emma had first called him Papa Mason and the way Hope had gradually learned to trust him with her fears and hopes. He wrote about teaching the twins to use tools in his workshop and watching Zoe's confidence grow in the kitchen. He wrote about bedtime stories and construction paper snowflakes and the way the farmhouse had come alive again with the sound of children's laughter. But mostly he wrote about love, the kind that arrives unexpectedly and changes everything, the kind that multiplies rather than divides, the kind that makes a family out of strangers and turns a house into a home. By the time he finished, it was past midnight and snow was falling again outside the kitchen windows. Mason sealed the letter and set it aside for Tom to include in the custody documentation, then made his nightly rounds through the house, checking locks and adjusting blankets, and marveling at the peace that had settled over his life like grace itself. In 3 days, they would discover that they were being watched. In a week, the anonymous phone calls would begin. In 2 weeks, Jennifer Walsh from Child Protective Services would arrive unannounced for an inspection that would determine the future of their family. But tonight, Mason Reed was simply a father checking on his sleeping daughters, counting blessings he never expected to receive, and preparing to fight for the family that had saved him as surely as he had saved them. The call from Jennifer Walsh came on a Tuesday morning while Mason was helping Emma braid her hair for the school Christmas pageant. The girls were in high spirits, chattering about their upcoming performances and the presents they'd been secretly wrapping for each other in the barn workshop. The normalcy of the moment, the domestic chaos of five children getting ready for their day, made the phone call feel like an intrusion from another world. "Mr. Reed, this is Jennifer Walsh from Child Protective Services. I understand you filed for emergency custody of 5 minor children." Mason's hand stilled on Emma's hair ribbon. Through the kitchen window, he could see Hope helping the twins load their science project into his truck, their breath creating small clouds in the cold morning air. Everything about the scene spoke of family, of belonging, of children who were loved and cared for. "That's correct," he said carefully. "I'll need to conduct a home visit and interview all parties involved. Are you available this afternoon?" "Of course, the girls will be home from school by 3:30. "Perfect. I'll see you at 4 o'clock. The line went dead and Mason found himself staring at the phone with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He'd been expecting this call for weeks, ever since Tom Harrison had filed the custody paperwork. Jennifer Walsh's visit would determine whether his makeshift family could become official or whether bureaucracy would tear apart what love had built. "Who was that Papa Mason?" Emma asked, twisting in her chair to look at him with curious blue eyes. "Just someone who needs to visit us today," he said, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Someone who wants to make sure you girls are happy here." Of course we're happy, Emma said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. We're the happiest we've ever been. If only it were that simple, Mason thought as he finished Emma's braid and sent her to join her sisters in the truck. The drive to school passed in the usual whirlwind of chatter and last-minute reminders about homework and permission slips. But Mason found himself memorizing details the way Hope automatically buckled Emma's seatbelt, how Zoe shared her mittens with Aria, the comfortable familiarity with which they all settled into their seats. These were the small moments that proved they were a family, but would Jennifer Walsh be able to see that? Or would she only see an unmarried man with 5 children who weren't legally his? Sarah was waiting by the school entrance when they arrived as she did most mornings now. She'd become such an integral part of their routine that the girls barely noticed how she always managed to be available for quick conversations about their progress, their concerns, or simply to offer encouragement for whatever small challenges the day might bring. "You look worried," she observed as the girls headed into the building with waves and promises to practice their pageant songs during lunch. "CPS visit this afternoon," Mason said quietly. "The formal evaluation." Sarah's expression grew serious. "How are you feeling about it?" "Terrified," Mason admitted. "Not because I think we're doing anything wrong, but because I know how quickly bureaucracy can destroy what love builds. I've seen it happen before during my banking days. Good families torn apart by regulations and red tape." "These girls belong with you," Sarah said firmly. "Anyone who spends 5 minutes observing your family dynamics can see that. They're thriving, Mason. They're happy, healthy, secure, everything children should be." "I hope Jennifer Walsh sees it that way." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the school buses disappear down the road. "Would it help if I were there? As a character witness, I could speak to their educational progress, their emotional development, the stability they've found with you." The offer touched Mason more than he could express. Sarah had become so much more than just the girls' principal over the past month and a half. She'd become their advocate, their friend, and increasingly the missing piece of their family puzzle. "That would mean everything," he said. "Thank you." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of nervous preparation. Mason cleaned house with the intensity of someone preparing for military inspection, though the farmhouse was already spotless. 5 children had given him plenty of practice at maintaining order amid chaos. He organized the girls' school papers, their medical records from Dr. Webb documentation of their enrollment and attendance. Everything that proved he was taking his responsibilities as their guardian seriously. By the time the school bus rumbled up the driveway that afternoon, Mason had worked himself into a state of controlled anxiety that he hoped wasn't visible to his daughters. But Hope, with her uncanny ability to read adult emotions, took one look at his face and immediately understood that something important was happening. "Is this about the lady you mentioned this morning?" she asked as they gathered around the kitchen table for their usual after-school snack. "Her name is Jennifer Walsh," Mason explained. "She works for the state, and her job is to make sure children are safe and well cared for. She's going to ask you some questions about living here, about how you feel about whether you're happy." "Are we in trouble?" Arya asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart. You're not in trouble. This is just part of making sure you can stay here permanently, making sure everyone understands that we're a real family." "We are a real family," Zoe said with conviction. "Anyone can see that." "Yes, we are," Mason agreed, "but sometimes grown-ups need official paperwork to understand what's obvious to everyone else." When Jennifer Walsh arrived at exactly 4 o'clock, Mason was struck by how different she was from what he'd been expecting. Instead of the stern, clipboard-wielding bureaucrat he'd imagined, she was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put the girls at ease. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said as Mason led her into the living room, where the girls were arranged on the sofa like a row of sparrows. "I know this can feel intrusive, but I want you to understand that my only concern is making sure these young ladies are safe, healthy, and happy." What followed was the most thorough examination of their family life Mason could have imagined. Jennifer interviewed him extensively about his motivations, his resources, his understanding of the challenges involved in raising 5 children who had experienced trauma and instability. She reviewed his financial records, his background check results, character references from community members who had observed his interactions with the girls. But the most important part of the evaluation was her time with the children themselves. Jennifer spoke with each girl individually, asking gentle questions about their daily routines, Their feelings about school and their living situation, their relationships with Mason and each other. Hope's interview was particularly moving. At 8 years old, she possessed an articulate understanding of her circumstances that impressed even the social worker. "We were scared for a long time," Hope explained, with the matter-of-fact honesty that characterized all her conversations. "We never knew where we'd sleep or when we'd eat next, or if someone would try to hurt us. But Papa Mason makes us feel safe. He takes care of us the way parents are supposed to take care of children." "Do you miss your mother?" Jennifer asked gently. "Every day." Hope said, her voice soft but steady. "But I understand why she had to go. She wanted us to be somewhere safe while she fixed the dangerous things in her life. Papa Mason is the safest place we've ever been." The twins, interviewed together at their request, focused on practical matters. "He teaches us things," Ruby explained, "how to use tools and how to cook and how to take care of the animals. And he never gets mad when we make mistakes," Arya added, "even when we accidentally broke the lamp in the living room." Zoe's contribution was characteristically thoughtful. "Before we lived here, I was always worried about taking care of everyone. But Papa Mason takes care of all of us, so I can just be a kid instead of trying to be a grown-up." Emma's interview was conducted with her favorite stuffed animal in her lap, and her responses were delivered with the absolute conviction that only children possess. "Papa Mason gives the best hugs," she reported seriously, "and he tells really good stories. And when I have bad dreams about the scary man, he sits with me until I feel better." It was this last comment that caused Jennifer to lean forward with increased attention. "What scary man, sweetheart?" Emma's face grew serious. "The man Mama was afraid of. The one who made us have to hide and run away. But he can't find us here because Papa Mason keeps us safe." After the individual interviews, Jennifer observed the family during their normal evening routine. She watched Mason help with homework, mediate a minor dispute between the twins over whose turn it was to feed the barn cats, and oversee the organized chaos of dinner preparation. She saw how naturally the girls included him in their conversations, how they sought his approval for small decisions, how they automatically turned to him for comfort when Zoe scraped her knee during their pre-dinner play in the yard. Most telling of all, she witnessed the bedtime routine that had evolved over the past 6 weeks. The girls' ritual of gathering in one room for story time, the way Mason tucked each one in individually with personalized conversations about their day, the comfortable domesticity of a family that had learned to trust each other completely. "Mr. Reed," Jennifer said as they sat in the kitchen after the girls were asleep, "I want to be completely transparent with you about my assessment." Mason's heart hammered against his ribs as he waited for her verdict. "In 15 years of child welfare work, I have rarely seen children who have experienced significant trauma adapt so completely to a new environment. These girls are thriving. They're emotionally secure academically, successful, physically healthy, and clearly bonded with you in ways that suggest genuine family attachment rather than mere gratitude or dependency." Mason felt his eyes begin to burn with relief, but Jennifer wasn't finished. "However, there are some complicating factors we need to discuss. The girl's mother hasn't been declared legally dead or permanently incapacitated. She hasn't formally surrendered her parental rights. If she were to return and petition for custody, the state would be obligated to consider her claims." "I understand that," Mason said, "but I also understand that she's been gone for 7 weeks without contact. At what point does the children's need for stability outweigh theoretical reunification possibilities?" "That's exactly the right question," Jennifer said with approval. "And in this case, given the length of abandonment, the children's clear preference, and the quality of care they're receiving, I'm prepared to recommend immediate approval of your emergency custody petition with a path toward permanent guardianship if the mother doesn't resurface within 6 months." The relief that flooded through Mason was so intense, it left him momentarily speechless. "Thank you," he managed to say. "Thank you for seeing what we have here, for understanding that family isn't always about biology. Family is about love, commitment, and showing up every day," Jennifer replied. "You've done all of that and more for these children. They're lucky to have found you." After Jennifer left with promises that the paperwork would be expedited and approved within the week, Mason sat alone in his kitchen and allowed himself to truly believe for the first time that his daughters were going to stay his daughters. The legal uncertainty that had been hanging over their heads was finally resolved. But even as he celebrated this victory, Mason remained aware that their situation was still fragile in other ways. Jennifer's mention of Claire's potential return had reminded him that love and law didn't always align, and that somewhere out there a woman was living with a devastating choice she'd made to protect her children by giving them up. 3 days later, as Mason was hanging Christmas lights on the farmhouse porch while the girls practiced their pageant songs inside, he spotted a figure at the edge of his property line. A thin woman in a dark coat stood partially hidden behind the large oak tree that marked the boundary between his land and the county road. Even from a distance, he could see the resemblance to hope in her posture and the way she held her head. Claire had come home. Mason's first instinct was to call out to her to invite her up to the house to see the children who had been asking about her in increasingly abstract terms as the weeks passed. But something in her body language, the way she stood partially concealed, the careful distance she maintained, suggested that she wasn't ready for a direct confrontation. Instead, Mason continued hanging lights while keeping her in his peripheral vision. For nearly an hour, Claire stood watch over the farmhouse where her daughters lived, close enough to hear their voices drifting through the windows, far enough away to avoid detection. Mason understood with a clarity that surprised him that she was saying goodbye. When she finally turned and walked back toward the road, Mason made a decision that would define the next phase of their complicated family story. He finished hanging the last string of lights, called to Sarah, who had arrived to help with dinner, that he'd be back in a few minutes, and followed Claire's footsteps through the snow. He found her sitting on a bench at the small park in the center of Cedar Falls, staring at the Christmas tree the town had erected in the square. She looked up as he approached, and Mason was struck by how much older she seemed than he'd expected. Not older in years, but older in the way that grief and fear and impossible choices aged a person from the inside out. "You're him," she said simply, "the man who saved my babies." "You're Claire," Mason replied, settling onto the bench beside her with careful respect for the space between them. "The woman who was brave enough to let someone else save them." They sat in silence for several minutes, two parents bound together by their love for 5 little girls who had bridged the gap between loss and hope in both their lives. "They look happy," Claire said finally. "I've been watching for weeks, and they look free, like children should look." "They are happy," Mason confirmed, "but they miss you. They talk about you, wonder where you are, hope you're safe." Claire's face crumpled slightly. "I miss them so much it feels like dying. But I can't. I can't risk bringing Marcus back into their lives. He's still looking for us. I've seen him twice since I left them, once in Billings, once in Great Falls. As long as he thinks they're with me, he'll keep hunting." "What if we found another?" Ben Mason asked gently. "What if we could guarantee their safety while still allowing you to be part of their lives?" Claire looked at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "You don't understand what he's like, what he's capable of. The things he did to Hope when she tried to protect Emma." "Then help me understand," Mason said. "Help me figure out how to keep them safe while keeping their family intact." What followed was the most difficult conversation Mason had ever participated in. Claire told him about Marcus Kellerman, the man who had been her boyfriend for 8 months when Hope was 6 and Emma was barely 3. She described the escalating pattern of control and violence, the way he had isolated her from friends and family, the terror she'd felt when she realized he was beginning to focus his attention on her daughters. "He never touched them sexually," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he hurt them in other ways. Psychological torture disguised as discipline. He convinced me it was normal, that I was overreacting, that all children needed firm boundaries." "But you got away," Mason said, "the first time. But Marcus is persistent. He's convinced that we belong to him, that we're his property. He's followed us across 3 states over the past 2 years. Every time I think we're safe, he finds us again." "Have you tried going to the police?" Claire's laugh was bitter. "Marcus is a police officer. Was anyway before he got fired for excessive force complaints. But he still has friends in departments across Montana and Wyoming. I tried reporting him once in Missoula. 2 days later, he showed up at my work with a restraining order claiming I was an unstable mother who had kidnapped his children." Mason felt a cold anger settle in his chest. "But he's not their father." "No, but he convinced a judge that our relationship was common law marriage and that he'd been acting as their father figure. It took 3 months and a lawyer. I couldn't afford to get that overturned, and by then we'd had to disappear again anyway." The complexity of the situation was staggering, but Mason found himself thinking not about the legal complications or the potential dangers, but about five little girls who deserved to know their mother loved them enough to sacrifice everything for their safety. What if you didn't have to disappear, he asked. What if you could stay in Cedar Falls, be part of their lives, but with protection that Marcus couldn't circumvent? How Mason pulled out his phone and showed Claire a photograph from the girls' school Christmas pageant the night before. Five small faces beaming with joy as they sang carols on the elementary school stage, their voices raised in harmony that spoke of security and belonging. Hope sang a solo, he said. Emma forgot half her lines but kept singing anyway. The twins were perfect angels in the nativity scene, and Zoe played Mary with more dignity than most adults could manage. Claire's eyes filled with tears as she studied the photograph. They look so beautiful, so healthy. They are, but they're not complete without their mother. That night, Mason sat at his kitchen table with Sarah Tom Harrison and Jennifer Walsh, who had agreed to an emergency meeting to discuss what Mason was privately calling the Claire situation. The girls were asleep upstairs, unaware that their entire world was about to shift again. Legally, this complicates everything, Tom admitted. Claire's return means we can't proceed with permanent guardianship without her consent or a formal surrender of parental rights. But morally, Sarah added, these children deserve to know their mother. They deserve to understand that she didn't abandon them out of indifference, but made an impossible choice out of love. Jennifer Walsh had been quiet throughout most of the discussion, but finally she leaned forward with the expression of someone who had seen enough broken families to recognize when one might be saved. There's precedent for shared custody arrangements in cases involving domestic violence, she said. Court-supervised visitation graduated reintegration safety protocols that protect both the children and the at-risk parent. It would require Claire to formally petition for visitation rights while acknowledging Mason's guardianship status, but it could work. What about Marcus? Mason asked. What about the ongoing threat? That's where we involve law enforcement, Jennifer said. Real law enforcement, not his old buddies. FBI if necessary, since he's crossed state lines in what could be classified as stalking. We document everything, we build a case, and we make it clear that any approach to this family will result in federal charges. It was a complex plan with no guarantees, but it offered something none of them had dared hope for: the possibility that Claire could return to her daughter's lives without endangering them, that Mason could remain their primary guardian while allowing them to reconnect with their birth mother, that their family could expand rather than fracture. The conversation that would determine their future was scheduled for the following Saturday morning in Judge Hendrick's chambers with all the relevant parties present. Claire had agreed to the meeting after 2 more days of careful negotiation and planning. The girls had been told that someone very important wanted to meet with their family, but not yet who that someone was. As Mason tucked them in on Friday night, he found himself memorizing details again. The way Emma curled up with her stuffed lamb, how Hope automatically checked that her younger sisters were comfortable before settling into her own bed, the quiet contentment that had become their bedtime norm. Papa Mason, Hope said as he was about to turn off her light. Yes, sweetheart. Tomorrow feels important, like something big is going to happen. Hope's intuition had always been remarkable, but her ability to sense significant moments before they occurred never failed to amaze him. Something big is going to happen, he confirmed. Something that might change our family in a good way. Will we still be together? Always, Mason promised. No matter what changes, no matter what happens, we will always be together. That's what families do. They stick together through everything. Hope nodded, satisfied with his answer in the way that children could be when they trusted the adults in their lives to keep their promises. But as Mason made his final rounds through the house that night, he found himself hoping that tomorrow would prove him right, that love really could triumph over bureaucracy and fear and the complicated realities of a world that didn't always recognize unconventional families as real ones. In 12 hours, everything would change again. But tonight, Mason Reed was simply a father checking on his sleeping daughters, counting blessings he never expected to receive, and preparing to fight for the family that had saved him as surely as he had saved them. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes with deep winter in Montana. Mason woke before dawn, as had become his habit since the girls arrived, and stood at his bedroom window watching the sun paint the snow-covered fields in shades of gold and pink. In 3 hours, he would sit across from Judge Hendricks and potentially face the most important decision of his life, whether the family he'd built could survive the return of the woman who had given birth to half of it. The girls sensed the gravity of the day from the moment they woke up. Even Emma, usually chattering, from the instant her eyes opened, was unusually quiet as they gathered around the kitchen table for what had become their traditional Saturday pancake breakfast. Hope helped her younger sisters get dressed in their best clothes, the dresses Sarah had helped them pick out for special occasions, while Mason fought to keep his own nerves from showing. "Papa Mason," Zoe said as he was braiding her hair, "you look scared." "I'm not scared," Mason said, then reconsidered the value of honesty with children who had learned to read adult emotions with survival-level accuracy. "Actually, I am a little scared, but sometimes being scared just means something really important is about to happen." "Are we going to meet our mama today?" Emma asked with the directness that had characterized all her most significant questions. Mason's hands stilled in Zoe's hair. They had agreed to wait until after the meeting to explain everything to the girls, but Emma's intuition had always been remarkably sharp. "How did you know that?" he asked gently. "I dreamed about her last night," Emma said matter-of-factly. "She was standing by our old storage shed, but she looked different, happier. And she said she was ready to come home, but only if it was safe." Hope looked up from helping Arya with her buttons, her dark eyes serious. "Is that why we're going to see the judge today? Because Mama wants to come home?" Mason knelt beside Hope's chair, meeting her gaze with the honesty she deserved. "Your mama has been trying very hard to make sure you're all safe. She's been talking with the judge and the lawyers about the best way to be part of your lives without bringing any danger with her." "Does that mean we might have to leave you?" Ruby asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart," Mason said firmly. "It means we might become an even bigger family. If everything works out the way we hope, your mama will be part of our lives too, but I will always be your Papa Mason, and this will always be your home." The relief that crossed all five faces was immediate and profound. These children had learned not to trust that good things lasted, but they had also learned to trust Mason's promises completely. Judge Hendrick's chambers at the Cedar Falls courthouse were designed to be less intimidating than the formal courtroom, but Mason still felt his heart hammering as he led the girls through the hallways lined with legal notices and government announcements. Sarah walked beside them, having volunteered to provide moral support and serve as a character witness if needed. Tom Harrison met them at the door with an encouraging smile and a folder full of documentation that proved how thoroughly their makeshift family had been investigated and approved. "Remember," Tom said quietly as they waited outside the judge's chambers, "this isn't about taking anything away from anyone. This is about finding the best way to give these children everything they need: love, stability, and connection to their whole family." When they were finally called in, Mason was surprised by how informal the setting felt. Judge Hendricks, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, had arranged chairs in a circle rather than the traditional courtroom configuration. Claire sat near the window wearing a simple blue dress that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had in the park. She looked up as the girls entered, and Mason watched her face transform with a joy so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Hello, my beautiful girls," she said softly, and her voice broke on the last word. The girls' reactions varied as dramatically as their personalities. Emma broke free from Hope's protective grasp and ran straight to Claire, throwing herself into her mother's arms with the absolute trust that had never been damaged by circumstances. Zoe and the twins approached more cautiously, but with obvious happiness. Hope remained by Mason's side, her expression carefully neutral. "Is it real this time?" Hope asked, echoing the question she'd posed months earlier when Claire had first tried to return to their lives. "Are you really staying, or are you going to leave us again when things get scary?" Claire's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she answered. "I'm staying, Hope. I'm not going anywhere ever again. But I'm not asking you to leave Papa Mason, and I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking if there's room in your family for one more person who loves you." Judge Hendricks allowed the reunion to continue for several minutes before gently calling the meeting to order. What followed was the most thorough examination of family dynamics Mason had ever witnessed. The judge spoke with each girl individually about their feelings regarding Claire's return, their attachment to Mason, their understanding of what a blended family arrangement might look like. Hope's testimony was the most complex, reflecting her role as the family's emotional barometer. I love my mama, she said carefully, but I also love Papa Mason, and I love the life we have here. I don't want anything to change that makes us feel unsafe again. What would make you feel safe? Judge Hendricks asked. Knowing that we can stay here in our house, going to our school with Papa Mason taking care of us every day, Hope said without hesitation. But also knowing that Mama can be part of that if she wants to be. The twins were more straightforward in their assessment. We want everyone to be together, Aria declared while Ruby added, like one big family instead of two separate ones. Zoe's contribution was characteristically practical. Could Mama live close by so we could see her lots, but still have Papa Mason tuck us in at night? Emma's response was the most emotionally compelling. I want to hug Mama every day and Papa Mason every day and not have to choose which one. When it came time for the adults to speak, Claire addressed the court with a composure that impressed everyone present. She formally surrendered her claim to primary custody while requesting shared parenting rights within a structured framework that prioritized the children's stability and Mason's role as their primary guardian. Your Honor, she said, I made the hardest decision of my life when I left my daughters in that storage shed, believing it was the only way to keep them safe. Mr. Reed gave them everything I couldn't: security, consistency, the chance to be children instead of refugees. I'm not here to disrupt what he's built for them. I'm here to ask if I can be part of it. Mason's testimony focused on his commitment to maintaining the children's connection to their birth mother while preserving the family stability they had found together. These girls need both of us, he said simply. They need their mother's love and their father's protection. If we can provide both within a safe framework, that's what's best for them. Sarah's professional assessment carried significant weight with the judge. As an educator who had observed the children's development over months, she testified to their remarkable progress in emotional stability. These children have found their equilibrium, she said. They're thriving academically, socially, and emotionally. Any arrangement that preserves that stability while allowing for healthy family relationships would be in their best interest. The legal framework that emerged from the discussion was more creative than anything Mason had imagined possible. Claire would be granted supervised visitation rights that would gradually expand as the children adjusted to her presence. She would relocate permanently to Cedar Falls, find employment that allowed her to contribute to the children's support, and participate in family counseling to work through the trauma and separation issues that affected them all. Most importantly, Marcus Kellerman would be served with a federal restraining order backed by FBI surveillance, making any approach to Cedar Falls or contact with the family a federal crime. Jennifer Walsh had coordinated with law enforcement agencies across 3 states to build a case that would keep him away permanently. This is highly unusual, Judge Hendricks admitted as she outlined the custody arrangement. But these are unusual circumstances that call for creative solutions. Mr. Reed, you will retain primary custody and guardianship of all 5 children. Ms. Collins, you will have graduated visitation rights, starting with supervised visits 3 times per week, progressing to overnight visits as the children adjust to your presence in their lives. She looked around the circle at the faces of everyone involved. 5 children who had found their safe harbor, a man who had rediscovered his purpose in fatherhood, and a woman who was learning that love sometimes meant letting go and sometimes meant fighting to return. The goal here is not to determine who has the greater claim to these children, the judge continued. The goal is to provide them with the richest possible family experience while maintaining the stability they need to continue thriving. Family comes in many forms, and this family appears to have found a form that works for everyone involved. The paperwork signing that followed felt ceremonial rather than bureaucratic. Mason's signature confirmed his role as primary guardian, while Claire's signature acknowledged that arrangement while establishing her rights as a participating parent. The children, too young to sign legal documents, nevertheless added their names to a symbolic family agreement that Sarah had helped them draft, a promise to love and support each other through whatever changes lay ahead. As they left the courthouse, the girls walked between Mason and Claire like a bridge connecting 2 parts of their world that had finally been reunited. Emma held both their hands, swinging between them with the joy of a child who no longer had to choose between the adults she loved. Hope walked with the measured pace of someone who was cautiously optimistic but still watching for signs that this happiness might be temporary. "What happens now?" Hope asked as they reached Mason's truck in the courthouse parking lot. "Now we go home," Mason said, "and we figure out how to be a family together." "All of us?" Emma asked, looking between Mason and Claire with anxious hope. "All of us," Claire confirmed, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I'm going to find a place to live here in Cedar Falls, and I'm going to be part of your lives every single day from now on." The drive back to the farmhouse was filled with the kind of chatter that only comes when children feel completely secure. The girls peppered Claire with questions about where she'd been, what she'd been doing, whether she remembered their favorite stories and songs. They told her about school and their friends and the Christmas pageant. She'd missed their voices, overlapping in their eagerness to share everything she'd missed during their separation. Mason found himself watching Claire in the rearview mirror, seeing how she drank in every word, every gesture, every small detail of the children she'd given up to save. The sacrifice she'd made was becoming clear to him in ways that went beyond the intellectual understanding he'd had before. She had chosen to live with the daily pain of missing her children's milestones, their bedtime stories, their scraped knees, and small triumphs, because she loved them enough to want them safe more than she wanted them with her. Back at the farmhouse, the day took on a dreamlike quality. Claire marveled at the children's bedrooms, the art projects covering the refrigerator, the comfortable domesticity of a home where children were cherished and encouraged to be themselves. She sat at the kitchen table where her daughters did their homework and listened to Emma play simple songs on the piano that had been silent for years before the girls arrived. "You gave them something I never could," she told Mason as they watched the five girls show her around the barn where they helped with chores and learned to use tools in his workshop. "You gave them something I never could either," Mason replied. "You gave them life and love and the understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust someone else to protect what matters most to you." That evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, 7 people now instead of 6, Mason looked around at faces that represented the most unlikely family imaginable. Claire sat beside Emma, helping her cut her chicken with the natural ease of muscle memory. Hope had positioned herself between Mason and her mother, symbolically bridging the two parts of her world. The twins flanked Claire on the other side, eager to reclaim the mother they remembered. Zoe sat across from Mason, her expression thoughtful as she processed the new dynamics. "Papa Mason," Emma said as they were finishing dessert, "can we still have story time tonight, with Mama too?" "Of course we can," Mason said. "We can have whatever traditions we want as long as they make our family happy." "What kind of family are we exactly?" Arya asked with the scientific curiosity that characterized all her questions. Mason looked around the table at this collection of people who had found each other through circumstances that should have been tragic but had somehow become miraculous instead. "We're the kind of family that proves love doesn't follow rules," he said finally. "We're the kind of family that shows how people can save each other even when they don't know they need saving. We're a family that got bigger instead of broken, that chose love over fear, that learned that sometimes the best in families are the ones you build yourself." Hope smiled, the first completely unguarded smile Mason had seen from her since Claire's return. "I like that kind of family," she said. "Me too," Claire added softly, and Mason could hear the gratitude and wonder in her voice as she spoke. "Me too." That night, as Mason made his traditional rounds through the house, he found all 5 girls crowded into Hope's room with Claire listening to a story about 5 brave princesses who lived in a magical kingdom where everyone was safe and loved. The scene looked like something from a storybook itself, a mother reunited with her children, a father who had found his purpose, and 5 little girls who had learned that families could be complicated and beautiful and strong enough to weather any storm. Standing in the doorway listening to Claire's voice weave tales of courage and happy endings, Mason understood that their story was far from over. There would be adjustments and challenges, moments of uncertainty and periods of growth. Claire would need time to rebuild relationships with children who had learned to live without her. The girls would need support as they navigated having 2 parents who loved them in different but complementary ways. But tonight, as snow began to fall again, outside the farmhouse windows and the sound of children's laughter drifted through rooms that had been silent for too long, Mason Reed knew that they had accomplished something remarkable. They had taken broken pieces, a grieving widower, 5 abandoned children, and a mother forced to make an impossible choice, and created something whole, something beautiful, something that proved families could be forged by love, rather than just biology. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. Next week would bring practical considerations about living arrangements and school schedules and the thousand small details of blended family life. Next month would bring continued healing and growth in the ongoing work of building trust and security. But tonight was perfect exactly as it was. 7 people who had found each other across the vast landscape of loss and hope, creating a family that was bigger than the sum of its parts and strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. In the morning, Emma would wake up and run to both Papa Mason and Mama Claire for hugs. Hope would continue her careful monitoring of family dynamics, gradually learning to trust that this happiness was permanent. The twins would begin the delightful work of getting to know their mother again. Zoe would adapt to the new rhythms with her characteristic pragmatism, and Mason and Claire would begin the complex, rewarding work of co-parenting 5 extraordinary children who had taught them both that love multiplies rather than divides, that families can be created as well as born, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that begin with loss and end with a love large enough to encompass every broken piece. The farmhouse in Cedar Falls had become exactly what it was always meant to be: a home where children were cherished, where love was unconditional, and where every ending was really just a new beginning in disguise. 6 months later, Mason Reed stood in the same spot where he'd first hung Christmas lights while watching a stranger observe his family from across the road. But now, in the warm June sunshine that painted the Montana landscape in shades of green and gold, he was watching Claire help Emma plant sunflowers in the garden bed they'd created together along the front porch. The transformation was so complete, so natural, that it was hard to remember a time when their family had been anything other than what it was now. The spring had brought changes that no one could have anticipated back in that snowy December, when 5 hungry children had asked for his leftovers and changed the trajectory of his entire life. Claire had found work at the Cedar Falls Community Center, running programs for at-risk youth, a job that seemed designed specifically for someone who understood what it meant to fight for children's safety and well-being. She'd rented a small apartment above Murphy's Diner, close enough to be part of the daily rhythms of family life, but far enough away to preserve the boundaries that helped everyone feel secure. The transition hadn't been without its challenges. There had been difficult conversations about bedtime routines and discipline strategies, about how to honor the girls' attachment to Mason while rebuilding their relationship with Claire. There had been tears and confusion moments when the children tested boundaries to see if this new arrangement would hold, and nights when both adults had questioned whether they were doing the right thing. But there had also been breakthrough moments that made all the complexity worthwhile. The first time Emma had fallen asleep curled between Mason and Claire during story time, her small body bridging the space between her 2 parents with unconscious trust. The afternoon when Hope had finally allowed herself to cry in Claire's arms about the fear and responsibility she'd carried during their months of hiding. The evening when Zoe had matter-of-factly announced that having 2 parents was actually pretty convenient because now there's always someone to help with homework. The legal resolution had come through in April, exactly as Judge Hendricks had outlined it. Mason's guardianship was permanent and uncontested, while Claire's parental rights were fully restored within the framework of their shared custody arrangement. More importantly, Marcus Kellerman had been arrested in Wyoming on federal stalking charges and would spend the next 5 years in prison with a permanent restraining order that would follow him for the rest of his life. But it was the small, daily moments that truly defined their success as a family. The way Claire had learned Mason's system for helping with homework and had added her own creative touches. How Mason had gradually relaxed his protective vigilance as he watched Claire prove day after day that she was committed to staying and building a life in Cedar Falls. The evolution of bedtime routines that now included both parents with stories and songs, and conversations that honored both the family they'd been and the family they were becoming. The community transformation had been remarkable to witness. Cedar Falls, which had initially greeted Mason's unconventional family with suspicion and whispered concerns, had rallied around them with the fierce protectiveness that small towns could show when they decided to claim someone as their own. Margaret O'Sullivan had organized a fundraiser to help with legal expenses that had raised 3 times what was needed, with the excess going into college funds for all 5 girls. The hardware store owner had donated materials for the workshop expansion that allowed Claire to teach woodworking classes alongside Mason. Even the anonymous letter writer had eventually revealed himself as old Mr. Peterson from the gas station, who had apologized publicly and become one of the family's most vocal supporters. Sarah Mitchell had become something more than a friend and something different from a romantic interest. She had become family in the way that people sometimes did when they were exactly what a household needed at exactly the right moment. Her relationship with Mason had evolved naturally from professional collaboration to personal friendship to something deeper that didn't require labels or definitions. She spent most evenings at the farmhouse helping with homework and sharing meals and contributing to the organized chaos that characterized their daily life. "She's going to ask you to marry her," Claire said one evening as they watched Sarah help the twins with a science project, while Mason and the other three girls worked on dinner preparation. "I can see it in the way she looks at you, at all of us. She's ready to make this official." Mason glanced at Claire, surprised by her directness and the complete lack of jealousy in her observation. Their relationship had found an equilibrium that surprised everyone, including themselves. They loved each other, not romantically, but with the deep, complicated affection of two people who had shared the experience of putting their children's welfare above their own desires and had emerged stronger for it. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. "I feel like these girls deserve to have every possible person who loves them be part of their lives," Claire said simply. "That loves them. She loves you, and she's been more of a mother to them than I was able to be for a long time. If she wants to make that role official, I'm not going to stand in the way." The conversation proved prophetic. 3 weeks later, on a warm Saturday evening in late June, Sarah asked Mason to walk with her to the old oak tree where they'd buried the family time capsule back in February. The girls were having a sleepover in the living room, building blanket forts and telling ghost stories while Claire supervised with the indulgent patience of someone making up for lost time. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, as they stood beneath the tree where early summer leaves filtered the setting sun into patterns of light and shadow, "about us, about the girls, about what we're building together. And and I think we should make it official. Not just us, all of us. The girls, Claire, you, me. One big, complicated, beautiful family that doesn't fit any traditional mold but works perfectly for who we are." Mason felt his heart skip in the way it did when life offered moments of pure possibility. "Are you proposing to me, Sarah Mitchell?" "I'm proposing to all of you," Sarah said, pulling a small velvet box from her pocket. "This ring is for you, but the commitment is to everyone. To Hope and her fierce protectiveness, to Emma and her boundless joy, to the twins and their endless curiosity, to Zoe and her practical wisdom, to Claire and her courage in rebuilding her life, to the idea that families can be chosen and created and expanded until they include everyone who belongs." The ring was perfect, simple, elegant, strong enough to withstand the daily wear of someone who worked with her hands and her heart. But more perfect than the ring was the way Sarah had understood instinctively and completely that marrying Mason meant marrying into something larger and more complex than a traditional nuclear family. "The girls should be part of this decision," Mason said. "And Claire, we've built something together that works because everyone has a voice." "I was hoping you'd say that," Sarah smiled, "because I may have already had a conversation with Hope about ring shopping, and she may have very strong opinions about what kind of wedding 5 girls and 2 moms and 1 dad should have." The proposal became a family meeting held around the kitchen table that had become the center of their domestic universe. Sarah presented her idea to 7 people who would all be affected by the decision, and the response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Does this mean you'll be our other mama?" Emma asked, climbing into Sarah's lap with the directness that characterized all her most important questions. "I'll be whatever you need me to be," Sarah said. "Stepmom, bonus mom, or just Sarah who loves you and lives here and helps take care of everyone." "I like Mama Sarah," Emma decided. "That way we have Mama Claire and Mama Sarah and Papa Mason, and everyone has their own special name." Hope's response was more complex, reflecting her role as the family's emotional barometer. "Will this change anything about how our family works, about the balance we've found?" "It shouldn't," Sarah said carefully. "The only thing that should change is that it becomes official that I'm committed to all of you forever, not just until something better comes along or circumstances change." "Good," Hope said with satisfaction, "because I like our family exactly the way it is. I just want to make sure it stays this way." The twins' contribution was characteristically practical. Can we help plan the wedding? Arya asked while Ruby added, and can we invite the whole town because everyone should see how happy we are? Zoe's question was the most thoughtful. What happens to families like ours when people get married? Do we stay complicated and beautiful, or do we become normal and boring? We stay exactly who we are, Mason assured her. The only thing that changes is that we have even more reasons to celebrate how special our family is. Claire's blessing came in the form of tears and laughter and a hug that encompassed both Mason and Sarah. I can't think of anyone I'd rather share the job of loving these children with, she said. Thank you for seeing what we have here and wanting to be part of it instead of trying to change it. The wedding planning that followed was unlike anything Cedar Falls had ever witnessed. 5 girls with 5 different ideas about what constituted the perfect celebration, 2 women who had learned to collaborate on everything from homework, help to bedtime routines, and 1 man who discovered that planning a wedding with 7 female opinions was both terrifying and wonderful. Hope wanted the ceremony to take place under the oak tree where they'd buried their time capsule, creating a symbolic circle that connected their past with their future. Emma insisted on sunflowers everywhere, not just decorations, but an entire field of them that they could plant together as a family project. The twins campaigned for a reception that included everyone in Cedar Falls, turning it into a community celebration rather than a private affair. Zoe wanted to write her own speech about what families could look like when love was more important than rules. Claire surprised everyone by asking if she could walk Sarah down the aisle. You're not just marrying Mason, she explained. You're marrying into our family, and I want to be the one who officially welcomes you into it. The ceremony itself took place on a perfect August evening, with the entire population of Cedar Falls gathered in the field behind the farmhouse, where sunflowers stood 8 feet tall, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold. Hope and Emma served as joint maids of honor, wearing matching dresses they'd helped design. The twins were flower girls who took their jobs so seriously they created intricate patterns with their petals. Zoe served as ring bearer and delivered a speech about chosen families that left half the audience in tears. But it was Claire's role that made the ceremony truly special. She walked Sarah down the makeshift aisle to where Mason waited beneath an arch of sunflowers and wild Montana flowers, then placed Sarah's hand in Mason's with words that captured everything their unusual family represented. Sarah, she said, you're not just joining our family today. You're completing it. You're the piece we didn't know we were missing, the person who makes all our complicated love make perfect sense. Take care of them and let them take care of you. And remember that the best families are the ones that grow from love rather than obligation. Mason's vows reflected the journey that had brought them all together. 3 years ago, I thought my chance at being a father was over. 18 months ago, I thought love was something that happened to other people. 6 months ago, I thought our family was complete exactly as it was. Today, I realize that love doesn't follow timelines or traditional patterns. It finds you when you need it, in the form you need it, with the people who are meant to share your life. Sarah, you're not just becoming my wife today. You're becoming co-parent to 5 extraordinary children, co-partner to an extraordinary woman, and the final piece of a family that proves love really can conquer everything. Sarah's vows were equally heartfelt. I used to think that families had to look a certain way to be real, that there were rules about who could love whom and how many parents children could have and what constituted a proper household. This family taught me that rules are less important than love, that traditional structures matter less than unconditional commitment, and that the most beautiful families are often the ones that don't fit any categories at all. Mason, Claire, Hope, Emma, Zoe, Aria, Ruby. You saved me from a life of loneliness I didn't even realize I was living. Today, I promise to love you, support you, and show up for you in whatever way each of you needs for as long as you'll have me. The reception that followed was indeed a community celebration, with tables set up throughout the sunflower field and food contributed by every family in Cedar Falls. Margaret O'Sullivan had closed Murphy's Diner for the day to cater the event. The hardware store owner provided lighting that turned the field into something magical as evening fell. Even old Mr. Peterson contributed by setting up a sound system that allowed the festivities to continue well into the night. But the most meaningful moment came when Judge Hendricks, who had attended as a guest rather than an officiant, stood to offer a toast that captured the significance of what they'd all witnessed. In 30 years of family court, she said, I've seen every possible configuration of custody and guardianship and parental rights. I've watched families torn apart by circumstances and rebuilt through legal frameworks. But I've never seen anything quite like this, a family that was created by choice, sustained by commitment, and expanded by love, until it included everyone who belonged. Mason, Sarah, Claire, and girls, you've shown all of us that families don't have to follow traditional patterns to be real, that love doesn't have to be simple to be strong, and that sometimes the most beautiful endings are really just the most beautiful beginnings. As the evening wound down and the community gradually dispersed back to their homes, the new family of 8 gathered on the farmhouse porch to watch fireflies dance among the sunflowers. Emma had fallen asleep in Mason's lap, while Hope leaned against Sarah's shoulder with the contentment of someone who had finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. The twins were planning elaborate schemes for rearranging furniture to accommodate Sarah's permanent presence, while Zoe was already working on ideas for next year's garden expansion. Claire sat in the rocking chair that had been Amy's favorite, watching the scene with the peaceful expression of someone who had learned that letting go sometimes meant holding on more tightly than ever before. Thank you, she said quietly to Mason and Sarah, though her words encompassed everyone present, for showing me that love really can multiply instead of divide, for proving that families can be bigger and more complicated and more beautiful than anyone ever imagines. 1 year later, on a crisp December morning that echoed the day when 5 hungry children had first asked for leftovers outside Murphy's Diner, the Reed Mitchell Collins family gathered around their kitchen table for a breakfast that included 9 people instead of 8. Sarah's pregnancy had been announced on Christmas morning, with a stocking hung among the others, a tiny stocking labeled Baby Reed Mitchell, that had sent the 5 girls into paroxysms of excitement about becoming big sisters. The baby boy who arrived in November was named David James Reed Mitchell, carrying names that honored both the grandfather he would never meet and the father figure who had taught his parents about unconditional love. But his siblings simply called him Baby Davy and treated him like the most precious treasure imaginable. Watching Hope help Emma feed the baby his bottle while the twins argued about whose turn it was to burp him, and Zoe read him a story about farm animals, Mason marveled at how naturally the family had expanded once again to include its newest member. Claire had moved into the farmhouse after the wedding, taking over the guest room that had been renovated into a master suite for grandparents who wanted to be part of the daily chaos. Sarah's belongings had blended seamlessly with the accumulated treasures of 8 other people who had learned that sharing space meant sharing love. Remember when you thought this house was too big and too quiet? Sarah asked as she watched Mason juggle feeding the baby while helping Aria with her math homework and listening to Ruby's detailed account of the class guinea pig's latest adventures. I remember thinking my life was over, Mason replied, shifting baby Davy to his shoulder for burping while checking Ruby's science project with his free hand. I remember believing that the best parts of my life were behind me. And now, Mason looked around the kitchen where homework competed for table space with baby bottles and art projects, where 3 adults managed the beautiful chaos of 6 children who ranged in age from infant to 10 years old, where the refrigerator was covered with school photos and crayon drawings and appointment reminders and love notes between family members. Now I know that the best parts were just waiting for the right people to make them possible, he said. This chaos, this noise, this beautiful mess of people who love each other, this is what happiness looks like. This is what family looks like when you stop trying to make it fit traditional molds and just let it be what it needs to be. That evening, as the older children helped with baby Davy's bedtime routine and Claire and Sarah collaborated on the next day's lunch preparations, Mason found himself thinking about Amy and Rachel. Not with the sharp grief that had characterized his thoughts for so many years, but with gratitude for the love they'd taught him and the foundation they'd provided for everything that came after. He could imagine Amy delighting in her baby brother and bossing around her 5 older sisters with the confidence of someone who knew she was beloved. He could picture Rachel finding ways to make holiday traditions special for 9 people instead of 3, creating the kind of inclusive celebration that honored everyone's needs and preferences. Most of all, he could feel their presence in the love that filled every corner of the farmhouse, not as ghosts clinging to the past, but as the roots of a tree that had grown larger and stronger and more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. Standing in the doorway of the living room, watching his family settle into their evening routines, with the comfortable efficiency of people who had learned to take care of each other, Mason Reed understood that his story wasn't about loss followed by recovery. It was about love that had learned to multiply, about families that could be created as well as born, about the way broken hearts could heal by learning to love even more broadly and deeply than before. The house that had once echoed with silence now rang with laughter and arguments and bedtime songs and the thousand small sounds of people who belonged together. The man who had thought his chance at fatherhood was over was now Papa Mason to six children who would carry his love with them for the rest of their lives. The woman who had sacrificed everything to keep her children safe had found a way to be part of their daily lives without compromising their security. The teacher who had spent her childhood in foster care had discovered that families could be created by choice and sustained by commitment. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, the first snow of another Montana winter. But inside the farmhouse in Cedar Falls, love had created its own warmth, and nine people who had found each other across the vast landscape of loss and hope were writing the next chapter of a story that proved the best families are often the ones that don't follow any rules except the rule of loving each other completely, exactly as they are. In the morning, Emma would wake up and run to check on baby Davy before seeking out hugs from all three of her parents. Hope would continue her careful guardianship of family harmony, gradually learning to trust that this happiness was permanent. The twins would discover new ways to include their baby brother in their elaborate games and schemes. Zoe would add baby care to her list of mastered household skills. Claire would go to work knowing her children were safe and loved and that she would be part of their evening routine. Sarah would teach her students while looking forward to coming home to the beautiful chaos of 8 people who depended on her and whom she depended on in return. And Mason would move through his day with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned that life's greatest gifts often come disguised as its greatest challenges, that the best love stories don't always follow traditional plots, and that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones that begin with strangers asking for leftovers and end with a love large enough to encompass every broken piece until it becomes something whole, something beautiful, something strong enough to weather any storm. The farmhouse in Cedar Falls had become exactly what it was always meant to be: a home where children were cherished, where love was unconditional, where every ending was really just a new beginning in disguise, and where 9 people had learned that families come in all shapes and sizes, but the best ones are always built on the foundation of showing up for each other day after day with open hearts and willing hands and the kind of love that multiplies rather than divides. And there you have it, the extraordinary journey of how 5 words changed 9 lives forever. From that snowy December day outside a small-town diner to a sunflower-field wedding that brought an entire community together, we've witnessed something truly remarkable: the birth of a family that rewrote all the rules about what love can accomplish. Mason found his purpose. Claire found her courage. Sarah found her calling. And 5 little girls found something every child deserves: a home where they're safe, loved, and free to just be children. But this story isn't really about them. It's about all of us. It's about the moments when we have the choice to walk away or step forward. It's about recognizing that sometimes the most profound differences we can make start with the smallest gestures of kindness. Every day, there are people in your community, children, families, neighbors, who need someone to see them, really see them, and offer help. Maybe it's not 5 children asking for leftovers, but it might be an elderly neighbor who needs groceries, a single parent struggling with childcare, or a child who just needs someone to believe in them. What Mason, Claire, and Sarah discovered is something we can all learn. Families grow when hearts expand, communities thrive when people care for each other, and love truly does multiply when we choose courage over comfort. So I'll leave you with this question. What 5 words might change your life? And more importantly, what 5 words might you speak that could change someone else's? Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Until next time, keep your hearts open to possibility.